Katie Strom from Educational Leadership is here, and so I guess one of our tasks is to find out all these hidden connections between the two talks today. So,
Yes.
And we'll open up for questions for everybody afterwards. Thanks. Go ahead, Katie. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Have people in here seen Monty Python before? Yes? Okay. So now for something completely different. Thank you. After I get mic'd up.
Do you have summary?
Yeah, I can stick this on my waistband of my pants. Is that okay? Okay, so let me go just back one. Okay, so yes, my name is Katie Strom, and I have the immense pleasure of representing the Educational Leadership Department here at Cal State East Bay. I'm originally from Alabama, but I've spent most of my adult life in California, except for a small stint on the East Coast where I got my doctorate at Montclair State University. Montclair State University is a historical teaching university, one of the first in the country to have a doctorate in teacher education. So that's what my background is, teacher education and development. And so I still study how teachers move their learning into practice, but I also study my own practice. And so that's where this presentation comes in. So one of my other passions is posthuman theory. I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a second. So this presentation is about how I put posthuman theory to work in teaching. And I'm gonna, although I think you can do that across disciplines, I'm gonna contextualize it by giving an example of preparing critical scholar practitioners in our social justice focused EDD program, the Educational Leadership for Social Justice EDD. So to set the stage, right now we are in troubling times, to say the least. We have ethno-nationalist movements that are growing across the world, not to mention in the United States here, and those are doubling down on individualistic worldviews, and they operate via fear of difference. These translate directly into our schools, where we have a dramatic increase of racialized, misogynistic, xenophobic, and homo and transphobic language, symbols, and acts. There's a Southern Poverty Law Center survey where you can read about this, where 9 in 10 teachers are reporting increased language and symbols and acts that are racialized, xenophobic, homophobic, and so on. Very problematically, in the United States, even though this is happening, teachers and leaders are socialized into ideas, the idea that they have to be objective and apolitical, that they could ever be objective and apolitical. So my argument that I'll make throughout this presentation and the way that I approach my teaching is that we have to prepare teachers and leaders to think differently in these complex times. We need them to think in multiplistic ways, in ways that are explicitly political, in ways that are connected and fluid, and importantly, in ways that consider difference as productive, as a creative force. So one of the ways that I think we can approach this different preparation of educators or getting them to develop a different mindset is by using theories like critical posthumanism, which decenter humanism. And so critical posthumanism, I could talk about this all day long, but just to summarize it in a few key ontological shifts, and by ontology I mean the way we live in the world, the way we exist in the world. It's a vital materialist perspective, so self-organizing intelligent matter, and like I said, it's about positive difference as a creative force. And these are 3 key characteristics. Is a shift from dualism, so seeing the world as totally separate, as being able to cut up into binaries and hierarchies, and moving to monism, which is we're all together, but we're not the same. We're just all connected up. Next is moving from that individualistic standpoint, the idea that I'm an autonomous actor in the world, I am isolated, I have a bounded body, to a reference point of multiplicities or assemblages. Assemblages are like constellations, and they're human, non-human, discursive, material elements, and they all share distributed agency. They all share agency, rather than the human having control of everything and being able to do things. So from the third one is moving from objective and neutral and universal, as I mentioned, thinking of teachers as being able to be apolitical or researchers as being able to be objective, to a paradigm that is accountable, that is explicitly political, and that situates within particular power structures and geopolitical and material conditions. Another way to think about this shift is arborescent thinking and rhizomatic thinking. So my favorite philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, call arborescent thinking the oldest and wariest type of thought. And there's particular characteristics. This is humanist thought. It's essentialized and universal, right? It comes down to the one. Everything is reduced down to the one. It's dichotomous and binary, right? So it proceeds by binary, by cutting up and moving up and reproducing itself. And it's fixed and static. It's rooted to one place. So this is problematic because if you just have one thing and it's rooting up and it's growing up and it's just reproducing itself, that means you're closing off possibilities for different thinking, which means you're reproducing the status quo over and over and over. And then another major problem is it creates this false sense of objectivity because this has been the dominant way of thinking for 400 years. It's become extremely internalized, which then obscures the fact that it comes from a very specific political location. This is not just value-free. It's Eurocentric thinking. It comes from 17th century Europe. And so it represents that political location. So the alternative, and rhizomatics is synonymous with posthumanism. It's just another name for it because it builds off of the rhizome, which is this scientific figuration right here. So it consists of many heterogeneous elements that come together, they connect, and they explode. So they come together, and every time they connect, they produce something new. So that's what we mean about positive difference. Difference is a creative force as these connections are happening. It's constantly changing. That's where the vital comes in, of vital materialism. And because all these elements are coming together and they're producing these new things, that's where you open up new possibilities for unthought or unimagined ways of being in the world, of teaching, of leading, of researching. But learning to think in these very different ways is really difficult. It's hard work. And in particular, these are ideas that break away from common sense thinking patterns, right? So I argue that insights from sociocultural theories, which is probably our most dominant learning theory right now, at least in the education fields. So concepts from sociocultural theories, and especially the concept of scaffolding, can help us introduce these ideas to students and then help them engage with them productively. So some key insights, and I'm going to apologize in advance if this is review for folks in the audience, but some key insights from sociocultural theory is that learning is social and co-constructed. It happens first in relationship. It's active. You have to do it. You have to do something. Participate in something. Learning is mediated by material and symbolic artifacts. So in other words, you have text, you have different kinds of materials, handouts, maybe it's manipulatives, but then you also have symbolic artifacts, which is like language, discourse. Learning happens ahead of development in the zone of proximal development, which I'll give you more information on in a second, with appropriate supports. So learning doesn't just happen. You don't just develop in a lockstep manner. You have to be pushed and supported in particular ways to learn. And then the whole learning process is apprenticeship. So students begin as novices, or what we might call peripheral participants, and as they practice, as they get appropriate supports, they become more central participants over time in relation to specific sets of knowledge and skills. So I want to spend just a second talking about the zone of proximal development. This is Lev Vygotsky's definition, so I'll give you a second to read that. So the zone of proximal development is what the student can do with help from others, with appropriate help from others. So here you have the zone of self-regulation. This is what the student can already do. Doesn't need any help, can do it totally by herself. This is the zone of frustration, which is, it's just right now, that's too far beyond, right? But here is the sweet spot. This is the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, where you can have a scaffold, which is any kind of flexible support that helps students move to autonomy. So it could be a probing question, it could be a graphic organizer, it could be a model of something, tons and tons and tons of different examples. So the other thing about scaffolding is Lev Vygotsky defined it as an expert other, or a peer that has more knowledge, but other folks in sociocultural theory have taken it up and expanded it. So it could be an expert other, it could be a peer with more knowledge, it could be an equal peer when you're coming together and you're grappling together and you're working out the understanding and co-constructing. And then it could also be internal resources. So maybe it's study skills that you've developed over time, or you're in the habit of asking yourself questions, or you're taking notes in the margin. Those are self-supports as well. Okay, excellent. So key takeaways. Okay, so if we're going to prepare teachers and leaders to develop these more complex ways of thinking, we have to move away from lecture-dominant models. Instead, we want to support them to engage with the complex theoretical concepts that I was talking about earlier. We want to do that through carefully crafted and participatory activities that are ongoing over time. And we want to do it in ways that help students bridge from what they already know into the unfamiliar in really well-supported ways that integrate social interaction or dialogue and are mediated by really thoughtful, physical, and symbolic artifacts. Okay, so really thinking about the ways that we're using language and the ways that we're supporting. So the example that I'm going to give to kind of show how that contextualizes into my classroom is called The Parable of the Three Researchers. And it's an activity that I developed. It's been in development over the last 3 years, and it's gone through several iterations. And basically, it's a set of 3 narratives that I wrote myself. And each narrative features a different EDD student. And they're fictional EDD students, but I wanted my students to have somebody that they could recognize. They could recognize not necessarily themselves, but it was somebody, a familiar, almost, caricature. So, does that look like it's gonna work?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, you can just go from there.
Go ahead.
Yep. Okay, excellent. Okay. Okay, so my objectives then with the lesson are I really want the students to rethink the notion of themselves as researchers as being able to be objective or separate from their research. And I want them to begin to develop an assemblage view of researcher and research. And remember when I said an assemblage, it's that constellation of human and non-human and material factors, right? So it's this sort of mixture of things. So basically how it goes is there was once 3 scholar practitioners who all were in their last year of an EDD program. And they were also all interested in the same problem, the quote, achievement gap, disparities in academic achievement between students of color and their white and Asian peers. And this is probably too small for you to see, but this is 10 years of data from the NAEP, which is an international, which is a test that we use to gauge sort of where our students are, how they're achieving. And so you can see our Latino students are here, and African American students are here, and this is white and Asian right here. So despite that common interest, all 3 of the researchers developed very different projects, which then had them, of course, have very different findings, and then it would do very different things in the world. So typically, I'm going to walk you through how I would do the activity, but for right now, I just want to give you a sense of who these people are, who these researchers are, and I also want to acknowledge the irony of me lecturing to you about something that should be a very participatory activity. So just having to say that. So Bob is researcher number 1. And he's a white guy. He's from a wealthy suburb in New Jersey. He's a football coach and becomes a principal in a middle-class district. He was attending an EDD program that was focused on accountability. So as principal, his black and brown students are not achieving at the same levels as his other students. So he wants to find out why. he names his project Solving the Problem of the Achievement Gap Among At-Risk Students. He decides he wants to interview his teachers, and he frames the interview as, why are Black and Latino students in your classes doing so poorly? Okay, so that's Bob, that's his research project. Gloria is second. Gloria, Latina, grew up in a high poverty area in East LA. Her family migrated to the United States when she was 7, and she was undocumented until the age of 15. She was also classified as Limited English Proficient, or LEP, for most of her schooling. Later in life, she becomes a bilingual teacher, and because of her experiences, is a fierce advocate for multilingual learners. She also decides, based on her experiences, she wants to attend an EDD program that focuses on critical pedagogy. So, meanwhile, multilingual learners and her students in the previous year had the lowest test scores out of all groups. And so she wanted to find out, how can we better support multilingual learners through powerful pedagogy? So she plans a project called Assets-Based Approaches to Powerful Learning for Multilingual Learners, and then she conducts in-depth case studies with 3 exemplar teachers to document their practice. Finally, we have Asada. She's a Black woman from a high-poverty neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland, who herself experienced, quote, cultural mismatch in her school. And cultural mismatch is when your language and your behaviors don't match the expectations. And so they didn't match the expectations of her mostly white teachers, and so she was punished quite often for that. She became a principal in Baltimore, and she notices the same thing happening in her school. So she's interested, also seeing that her Black students are underachieving. She says, how might cultural mismatch be impacting Black student test scores? So she designs a 2-part study. The first part of the study, she interviews students of color regarding how they perceive the test and how it might impact their self-esteem and attitude towards the school. Then she conducts a content analysis of the test using a frame of cultural mismatch. So the students get these narratives, and I first have them in expert groups read one of the narratives, right? So I have 3 different groups, they're reading one narrative each. So they first read individually, and they take notes in the margins, and then they get together with their group who all read the same narrative, and they answer in a column. Actually, let me pass out the graphic organizer. Also, as I mentioned, in this activity, they go all the way through findings. Let me pass those out. Yes, thank you. They go all the way through findings. I just focused here, because I have a short amount of time, I just focused here on the first part, the design of the study. But you can see the graphic organizer here. So in their expert groups, they're only filling in one row. If they had Bob, they're only filling in Bob, okay? So they have to work with their group to come to consensus. Next, they go into heterogeneous groups. So typically you would number off by whatever, figure out how many groups you need. If you have enough, maybe they number off by 5. And then you have 5 different groups, each of which has representation from those original expert groups. So there's one representative from each narrative. They share the key ideas across, and the other students have to listen carefully, and they have to write down the key ideas from the other 2 researchers. And then when they're done with that, they discuss across stories. What were some of the common dimensions that were shaping the research studies? And they come to consensus on a possible moral of the story. So some of the key things that students pull out typically when we're looking at the dimensions that shape research, they pull out, well, the researcher background and identity was definitely a shaping factor. Their previous education and their current preparation in their EDD programs, the things they were interested in themselves, where they located the problem. Was the problem with the students? Was the problem with the pedagogy? Was the problem with the test? They had particular access to context. They had particular institutional influences. There were sets of historical and sociocultural norms and discourses. They had particular ideas about theory and knowledge. And they all took a particular approach to design their study, which of course would also determine the knowledge that was produced. So some of the key things that, to summarize here, is that research isn't something that's done or found by a distant objective researcher, but it's something that's collectively produced by an assemblage or a multiplicity of elements that are connected to and influenced by forces that are personal, political, sociocultural, contextual, and so on and so on. Also, as I had noted before, agency isn't something that's held totally by the researcher. Yes, she is an active agent in her research, but it's also distributed across this assemblage. All of these factors are collectively producing the study and its eventual impact. And then mapping out an assemblage like this and looking at the particular situated relations of power, influence, and interaction, I argue that that can help teachers and educational leaders not only develop grounded and accountable views of their own research, but also their own practices in their institutions. And then they can also, by doing that power analysis, they can say, where are the spaces of agency for disruption of oppressive status quos? Okay, so to summarize the pedagogical piece, how were students supported to enter into critical posthuman thinking? And again, if I had an hour, this is an activity that I would have done with you, and then we would have gone back and looked at this. Would have been a little more powerful. But so from the first part of the jigsaw, the scenario was recognizable to the students, so bridging from their own experience into the content. I had questions to focus their attention. They have a note-taking aid, a graphic organizer. They discussed in expert groups, and then they came to consensus, which is peer-to-peer scaffolding. In the second part of the jigsaw, they had the organizer. They also had to actively listen because there was an information gap that was created by the use of those different columns and those expert groups. And then finally, there was discussion in heterogeneous groups and a coming to consensus, which again is peer-to-peer scaffolding as they're co-constructing. So this pedagogy is, I'm talking about an example that's specific to my own context, but this type of pedagogy is good for everyone, and it's good across disciplines. We need to move away from lecture-based models and into more sociocultural supported models. So that's my presentation. If you're interested in further reading on posthumanism or on any of the things that I've talked about, Rosie Braidotti, The Posthuman, that's a real foundational reading. Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus. I have a piece that's an introduction to a special issue that I co-edited in Issues in Teacher Education on thinking with theory in an era of Trump. I have a article that I wrote with our wonderful EDD director that has multiple examples of putting theory to work in EDD programs. And then this particular example comes from a book chapter that's currently in press. Thank you very much.